Greetings Watchers one and all, the Watchful One here, and we continue our spiral into darkness. I just hope we don't spiral out of control this year, and that we don't spin down the rabbit hole. Okay, I'll stop. I just wanted to get those jokes out of the way, because continuing our theme to intros to horror, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite horror manga artists. That's right, a very brief look into the work of Junji Ito. And this will be brief because I could literally talk for hours about Junji Ito's work, especially Uzumaki. And maybe next year I will devote an entire episode to it, but for now we're just gonna take a brief look at Junji Ito's work. And if you want a much more in-depth look at Junji Ito's work, I'd recommend Super Eyepatch Wolf's video on it. I'll be putting a card up right now to it. But in any case, who is Junji Ito? Well, he's a horror manga artist that got his start doing short horror stories. However, he's also done long-term stories like Gyo and Uzumaki, but also got his start on the comic Tomine. By the way, full disclosure, I apologize if I butcher any of these names. I've also not read Tomine, so I can't really say much about it, but long story short, it's about a woman who falls on bad luck where every man she dates ends up murdering her. But she can never die, so she comes back and murders them as well. And believe it or not, what if I told you that was the more tamer Junji Ito stories out there? Cause his stories delve into very dark and interesting material, and more often than not have a few underlining aspects to them, one of which is the horror of suburbia. Most if not all of Junji Ito's work take place in suburban Japan, and he tends to take these suburban everyday things like, say, a cat, a next door neighbor, or even just a woman trying to assist you, and turns it into something much darker and corrupted. So it really speaks volumes about Junji Ito's work that he's able to take something as innocuous as a cat and make it unsettling. And the one I'd have to say that shows that off the best is The Window Next Door. Now, I'm not a comic reader, so I'm obviously not gonna actually be reading the comic, but for real, if you want to check these comics out, I'm actually using images from Obabs Scribbler's reading of it. In fact, all the footage in this short little video is from her, so I'd recommend checking her stuff out. But in any case, The Window Next Door tells the story of a family that moves into a new house in the suburbs. They find the house next door is almost never occupied for some reason, but they do believe someone lives there. But then one day the son, whose room is literally right next door to the other house, suddenly hears the talking of a woman. So he finally gets a good look at this woman, and yeah. The reason why I chose this as one of my examples is because it actually shows off one of Junji Ito's greatest aspects, his amazing attention to detail. Look at the picture of this woman. Look at how much detail is in her skin. The intense uncomfortableness you feel looking at it because it's human yet also not human. It goes far beyond the uncanny valley. And it doesn't stop with her face either. Her nails are also super hyper realistic. Junji Ito loves putting intense detail and shading over what's supposed to be scary. It gives it an uncanny realness that makes it feel that much more terrifying, making you feel uncomfortable just looking at it. And that's the most I want to say about that comic, because I encourage you guys to check these out on your own time because they are honestly that good. I'm just here to helpfully sum up why you should be reading Junji Ito's stories and why I think they could get you into horror. Now, granted, his work can be rather intense. Not a lot of it is very gory, but it is very detailed with its horrific imagery. However, if there's another thing that Junji Ito takes heavy inspiration from, it's the work of H.P. Lovecraft, and specifically eldritch horror. And for a comic that shows that off perfectly, I'd recommend The Enigma of Amigara Faults. To sum it up, it tells the story of an earthquake that hits a nearby town in Japan, and it creates these giant fault lines. But what's interesting is that the fault lines have the indents of people on them, and before long, someone actually says one of them is his, that it perfectly resembles his and is calling him, and so he just slides on in. And honestly, for real, my descriptions do not do any of this justice. Go seek these out on your own, because it's actually far more horrifying than it makes it out to be. And it also shows off Junji Ito's love of eldritch horror, basically horror that can't even be comprehended by human logic. And I can certainly see why, because eldritch horror has the benefit of having paranormal activity that can't even be comprehended or explained. And I think that's to the benefit of his work because it makes the horror that much more scarier. Because any old normal monster like a werewolf or a vampire, you know how to beat them because you understand them. But how the hell do you fight against the very concept of a spiral, for example? You can't. To be put simply, which is scarier, a creature that you can understand and fight, or one that you can't even comprehend? And before I end this segment, there's one more thing I gotta mention about Junji Ito that he's an absolute master of, and that he's able to convey jump scares through comics with something called the page turn. And yes, I've been stepping around this, so we gotta briefly talk about his magnum opus. Let's briefly look at the first story of Uzumaki. Now, the full trade of Uzumaki is a big book, so I can't talk about the whole story right now. Maybe next year I'll devote an entire video to it, but for now it's just the one chapter. So the setup for the entire series is that this small town is plagued by the concept of a spiral. Now again, there's nothing really intentionally scary about a spiral, but Junji Ito is able to make it terrifying. And we waste no time with that, as the very first story is about a man obsessed with spirals. He collects anything with spiral patterns, shells, decorations, anything, until eventually he manipulates his own body to twist into spiral motions like spinning his eyes around. But then one day he buys a giant case, disappears, and they go to investigate the case, and this is the point where I have to talk about the page turn. Cause see, it's much different from the jump scare of say a game or a movie. In those, they are predetermined and you have no control over when they happen. They give you that rush of adrenaline because you don't have a choice. Now granted, I'm not one of those people that says jump scares are all bad. There are some very good jump scares. What I am saying is that at the end of the day, it's not up to you whether the jump scare happens. But for a comic, it's a different story. It's up to you to decide if you're ready for what's around the corner. And when you do, Junji Ito often punctuates it with a big reveal, but just before it showing a character reacting to it off screen, tempting you to turn the page. And then it reveals what was truly scary all along. Now, I don't want to spoil any more of the comic, and also I understand that I can't really convey the greatness of the page turn through this because obviously I'm editing it. But take my word for it, Junji Ito is a masterclass of horror, and I highly recommend him if you want to get into horror comics. And that's about all I got to say. Yeah, this one's gonna be on the shorter side. I want to do some mini episodes so I can keep up with the upload schedule. But tune in next week where, God, I don't even know what I'm gonna talk about, but you'll find out. I'm the Watchful One saying keep on watching. I'll see you guys next time.